Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Debbie Sasko, and I'm the AVP of Information Services at UIIA. I also have with me today Sherry Parnell, who's one of our program managers, and Mark Blueball, UIIA's General Counsel. This webinar today is a first in a two-part series that we're going to be providing an overview of specific sections of the UIIA that we often receive questions on, and hopefully the result will be to provide a clearer understanding of these terms within the agreement. This first session will cover Section E1 related to equipment return, Section H, the dispute resolution process, and Exhibit D of the UIIA, the binding arbitration process. During the webinar, please feel free to submit questions by using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screens. We'll reserve time at the end of the session to take questions submitted. If we're unable to get to all of the questions during the session, we will get back to the party directly following the webinar. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The first item we're going to cover is equipment return. We're going to take a look at the responsibilities of the motor carrier and the equipment provider under the UIIA as it relates to equipment return. For motor carriers, this section states that the use of equipment is to be used for the purposes for which it was interchanged, and that the motor carrier should not authorize the use of that equipment by any other parties unless they have written or electronic consent of the equipment provider to do so. The return of the equipment should be to the original point of the interchange, unless we know that often is not the case in today's industry. So EPs may request that motor carriers return equipment to a satellite location, and the process to request that is covered under Section E1B of the UIIA, which would either be by a bilateral agreement between the motor carrier and the equipment provider. The EP can post their potential satellite locations via an internet posting, either on, which is often on the EP's website or on a third-party site like returnlocation.com that some of the equipment providers use. Or the EP can post their potential satellite location via UIIA's equipment return location directory, which is housed on the Information Services website. Section E1B also indicates that if the return location changes, that the EP has to notify the motor carrier by 4 p.m. local time, the business day prior to that change becoming effective. We often will receive inquiries from motor carriers stating that they didn't receive the required notification, or that the terminals may have implemented some type of specific limitations regarding empty returns on the spot without the advance notice to the equipment provider, in turn not allowing the equipment provider to provide that notice that's required under E1B to the motor carrier. For the purposes of notification, motor carriers should make sure that all of their contact information under their UIIA account is up to date, and including their email information. And equipment providers should also ensure that their contact information we have on file for them is up to date and current as well. Moving to the next slide, we'll look at what the EP's responsibilities are under Section E1 as it relates to equipment return. And EPs should make sure that their potential satellite location information is kept up to date, whether it be on their own internet posting on their own website or via a third-party website. And also, if you house your information on UIIA's equipment return location directory, there are specific processes that are outlined in the agreement as to how you have to maintain that information and keep it updated, and also in regards to the effective date of any changes to your postings on the equipment return location directory are also noted under Section E1 of the agreement. When we get notifications of changes to that equipment return location directory information, we then send the notice to the motor carriers, and the effective date of those changes is 14 calendar days from the date we send the notice to the motor carrier. When the equipment return location changes, equipment providers need to make sure that the proper notice is provided via email to the motor carrier. That notice, again, has to be provided by 4 p.m. local time, the business day prior to that change becoming effective. This would include limitations or restrictions that a terminal may impose that in turn may impact the motor carrier's ability to return equipment to the intended return location. We know that many times the steamship lines are not made aware of these types of restrictions that are set by the marine terminal operators in advance, which makes it difficult sometimes for them to provide the required notice to the motor carrier. Consequently, it's very important that the EPs make sure that they communicate with the facilities that they use and make them aware of what their obligations are under the UIIA so that they can in turn provide the advance notice to the motor carrier when that equipment return location changes, since that's their obligation to do so under Section E1B of the agreement. When you look at the marine terminal operators, these entities are not signatories to the UIIA, so they're not contractually obligated to the terms of the agreement. As mentioned previously, this is why it's extremely important that the EPs make the marine terminal operators that they use aware that when terminal restrictions or limitations are implemented, that the EP needs to be made aware of that information as soon as possible so that as a UIEP, they can then comply with the notification requirements that they are required to do under Section E1B. Slide number 5 here, we receive questions sometimes, often regarding what motor carriers should do if they do not receive the required notice of changes to a return location that's required under Section E1 of the agreement. What this slide does is outline some of the actions that motor carriers can take. First, they should contact the specific EP, let them know that they didn't receive the required notice of change in the return location. We also, back in November, we created a new email address that participants can use to send inquiries related to ongoing business issues that are related to UIA processes. And that email address is uiaissues@uia.org. In this instance, if the proper notice is not provided by the EP, the motor carrier can send an email to the UIA issues address. And what we need you to do is identify the EP that you're indicating didn't comply with the notification requirement. And you also need to provide an example of what the noncompliance was. And that can be a copy of a screenshot from the terminal or the EP identifying that the equipment return information has changed on the same day it is to become effective, and that you weren't provided with notification of that. What we'll do then, we check that UIA issues email address on a daily basis. If we get notification via email from a motor carrier of any type of noncompliance, we'll then notify the equipment provider and make sure that they are aware, or that they make their various offices aware of what their obligations are under Section E1. And a record of that email will also be maintained by our office so that should an arbitration claim come in, the motor carrier or whichever party can use that email notification as part of their supporting documentation to say their dispatch records or whatever. Another question we receive often is what types of charges are covered under the UIA as it relates to equipment return, as well as questions related to motor carrier compensation for services rendered. As you can see from this slide, that per diem charges, maintenance and repair charges, and chassis use rental charges are the types of charges that are covered under the UIA as it relates to equipment return. The chassis use rental charges would be applicable if the chassis provider is a UIA participant. The types of charges that are not addressed under the UIIA are any type of storage charges that are incurred by the motor carrier, and also questions related to terms related to motor carrier compensation for services rendered. Storage and compensation charges are outside the scope of the UIA and would be covered under a commercial transportation agreement between those two parties. If there is no transportation agreement between the motor carrier and the EP, then the matter would still be outside of the UIIA and would have to be handled between those two parties directly. One clarification that we'd like to make in regards to compensation of services to the motor carrier, we've received from motor carriers in the past that there are some EPs that interpret Section E1 to mean that the motor carrier does not need to be compensated when requested to return equipment to a satellite location. The clarification we want to make is that UIA doesn't address compensation of services to the trucker when they perform services for the equipment provider. However, if you look at Section E1E of the agreement, it does clearly indicate that nothing in this section of the agreement should be interpreted to preclude the motor carrier from receiving compensation for services in these circumstances. But again, the terms related to that compensation would be addressed between the two parties outside of the UIA agreement. If we move to the dispute resolution process and binding arbitration, when a motor carrier receives an invoice that it believes is not correct, it should dispute those charges with the equipment provider. When making the decision to dispute those charges, the motor carrier needs to make sure that it finds out if the specific equipment provider has a dispute resolution process within its addendum. Because there are some providers that do and then some that don't. And if there's no process in the addendum, then Section H1 of the agreement would be used, which is the default dispute resolution process under the UIIA. And this default process allows the motor carrier to dispute the charges within 30 days from receipt of the invoice. It's important that when you're disputing charges that you include supporting documentation with your dispute that supports your argument that you don't believe you're responsible for the charges based on the terms of the agreement. That type of supporting documentation can be in various forms. It could be an outgate EIR. If it's an M&R invoice, it could be an outgate EIR showing the condition was pre-existing. You could use dispatch records, terminal notifications, there's various supporting documentation that can be used. And should you ever dispute a case and you have questions in regards to the types of documentation that you can provide as part of your case, you can certainly contact our office and we'll be happy to clarify that for you. You also want to make sure that you send your initial dispute to the appropriate contact within the EP's organization. Oftentimes, the EP will have this information on their invoices, or it may be contained within their UIA addendum. It's important that you make sure that even though you may copy multiple individuals on your dispute, that you include that specific contact that's noted within the EP's dispute resolution process in their addendum. Because one of the things that we will check is to see if the dispute was sent to the correct party, if that particular dispute goes to arbitration. There's a link on the UIIA website to UIIA equipment provider contact information, so you can simply go to the UIIA website, click on that link, and it will have equipment provider control contacts, which are the corporate contacts. It'll have also contacts for motor carrier disputes, as well as links to the UIIA websites and a listing of EP addenda revisions. So there's a lot of information on the UIIA website that may be helpful to you when you're trying to contact a provider. Okay, and motor carriers need to make sure that you allow the EP the time frame that they're allowed to respond to your dispute. So if an equipment provider has a dispute resolution process within its addendum, it may indicate that they have a certain number of days to respond to your dispute. So you have to allow that time frame for them to respond before, if you're thinking about submitting that claim for arbitration, you would need to allow that full time frame for the EP to respond. So for example, if an EP has 30 days to respond to your dispute, you would not be able to submit that dispute for binding arbitration until that 30-day time frame had elapsed. So on the 31st day, if you've not gotten a response from that equipment provider, you would then be able to submit the claim for binding arbitration if that's what you chose to do. And the same thing would follow if the dispute was being submitted by the invoicing party, which would be the equipment provider. There's certain time frames that have to be allowed and met before that claim can be submitted for binding arbitration. Slide 8 here just shows you some statistics from our binding arbitration process since its inception. It was put into the UIIA in 2008. It's been a very useful tool, we believe, based on the feedback that we've gotten from participants as an alternative method for trying to resolve disputes outside of them going to a legal avenue. So you can see the metrics here that since its inception, we've had 794 cases come into the process. Out of those 794, 514 of them have actually met the criteria. And the 280 that did not meet the criteria, most of that was based on that it was due to time frame issues. Maybe that and the motor carrier may not have disputed the charges within the proper time frame, or it may have been in regards to the types of charges that was submitted under the binding arbitration. But then you can see the breakdown of the cases that met criteria. We have had 324 cases go completely through the process and have a decision rendered. 183 cases have actually come in, and then prior to them going to the arbitration panel for determination, they were resolved between the parties. So that's a good thing, that it may have taken the submission of it under the binding arbitration, but then the parties looked at it again and determined this is something that we're going to either cancel the charges, or it's not. We don't need to take it to arbitration. And then we currently have 7 cases that are currently pending under review. And you can see at the bottom the case decisions rendered. We've had 47% of the cases have been rendered in favor of the motor carrier, 40% in favor of the EP, and then 13% were a split decision. And a split decision would mean that there were multiple charges involved in the case, and when the panel looked at it, they found a portion of those charges in favor of the EP and then a portion in favor of the motor carrier. When you look at the types of charges that are acceptable for binding arbitration, there's 3 types. They can be a per diem, invoice involving per diem charges, an invoice involving maintenance and repair charges, or an invoice involving equipment use rental charges. And the equipment use and rental charges, again, would be those related to a chassis provider that was a UIIA participant. Some of the types of charges that sometimes are submitted and are not currently acceptable would be misuse charges, cleaning charges, or lost, stolen, the depreciated replacement value charges. But if you notice under the per diem charges, if you do have per diem charges that resulted from equipment that has been lost and stolen, those charges are acceptable for binding arbitration. So if you receive those types of charges and you dispute them and you don't, there's no resolution between the parties in regards to that dispute, then you certainly have the option to submit that claim for binding arbitration. And as I indicated earlier, we do look at the binding arbitration timeline. So when we get a case, we take a look at it to ensure that the following timelines have been met. One, that the invoice party initially disputed the charges with the EP within the established time frame, either within the EP's dispute resolution process and its addendum, or if there is no process in the EP's addendum, then we look at the time frame under Section H1, which, as I mentioned earlier, is you have 30 days from receipt of the invoice to dispute those charges. We also look to make sure that the claim was submitted within 15 calendar days of the EP's denial of the motor carrier's dispute. This means as soon as the EP responds that the dispute is declined, that 15-day clock starts. Consequently, if you think you want to arbitrate the charges, you would need to ensure you met this time frame or the case would be rejected. And there's many times that there's lots of communication that goes on back and forth between the equipment provider and the motor carrier, but what we're looking for when we look at the case to determine when that 15-day time frame starts is we're looking at when the EP actually came back and indicated we are denying your claim. So that's the terminology, or that's the point that we're looking for to start that 15-day clock. And as mentioned before, the motor carrier should allow the equipment provider the full time frame that they have to respond before they actually submit the claim for binding arbitration. So if the EP has 30 days to respond, you need to allow that 30-day time frame to go forward before you actually submit the case for binding arbitration. The next slide here, the criteria we look at is when we get a binding arbitration claim is we look to make sure that it's an acceptable type of charge. So either it's a per diem dispute, a maintenance and repair dispute, or it's an equipment use rental charges dispute. We also look to see if the initial dispute was done within the time frame that was set forth in the dispute resolution process, either in the EP's addendum or in the base agreement. If that default process is used and there's no process within the EP's addendum. And we also look to see if the claim was submitted within the 15-day time frame from the EP's response and that all required documentation has been submitted with the claim when we get the notice of intent form. So with that, I think Sherry Parnell, again, is on the line with us today, and she handles all the administrative work associated with putting together the arbitration cases. So she's now going to provide an overview of how to initiate a typical arbitration claim, including going over the types of supporting documentation that are needed and the various steps in the arbitration process that can be found in Exhibit D. She's works with these cases and has been working with them since the inception of the DRP case, so I'm going to turn it over to her now. Sherry?
Thank you, Debbie. So we're getting a lot of questions in, so we will be hopefully answering some of those questions that are coming in the remaining of the webinar. So in order to properly review your claim, you will need to provide the following required documentation. These are required documents that you need to provide to our office in order for us to review your claim. The Notice of Intent form, you will need to complete the top half of the Notice of Intent form and send it to our office with the following documentation. Basis of dispute, which is a statement from your company stating the reason why you're disputing the invoice that includes the following details, which is the invoice date, invoice number, and the amount you are disputing. The date you received the invoice from the equipment provider, the date you disputed the invoice, and the date the EP responded to your initial dispute. The provision of the agreement you are basing your dispute on. You'll need to include copies of the invoices being disputed, the in and out gate EIRs that pertain to each invoice, the email communication between your company and the equipment provider showing that you have properly disputed the invoice with the EP, along with the EP's response to your dispute. If it's an M&R maintenance and repair claim, you will need to include the AGS gate images or any photos that were provided to you by the equipment provider, but the images do need to be in JPEG format. If they're provided in a PDF, they're just very hard to read. So if you can get it in JPEG, that's the best way to provide your images, as well as any other documentation that you wish to submit to prove your claim. The example of additional supporting documentation may include email communication showing terminal closures, row closures, the terminal restrictions or limitations within the facility. You have the dispatch records that show the driver attempts to gain access to the facility but was turned away. Now, if you have any screenshots or any detailed information that you can provide, you want to provide that in your documents. Any emails, any screenshots, anything that would pertain to your claim. Any email notification sent to the UIIA showing the EP's non-compliance with the required notification of change in equipment return instructions. Emails should include the date equipment return attempted, the terminal name, EP company name, motor carrier's company name, motor carrier SCAD code, driver's name, license number. It should have all of the details needed in order to support your claim. Any turnaway tickets, if provided by the facility. If they do not provide turnaway tickets, try and get, again, screenshots, written notices, anything that can show that your driver was turned away and why. Any other evidence that you may want to submit for your claim, you can submit any kind of evidence. If you have any questions on what you can submit or what you want to submit, you can always give me a call. To go over the arbitration process, the invoice party, which is the moving party that is submitting the claim, would submit the notice of intent along with all of their supporting documentation to the UIIA office. If all of the required information is not included, the claim may be rejected and returned back to the moving party. Motor carriers may submit multiple invoice disputes under a single arbitration as long as all invoices involve the same related charges or identical facts and the same EP. So if they're all on one equipment provider, you can submit the claim as one if you have more than one invoice. All arbitration claims should be submitted to me via email, which sherry.parnell@intermodal.org, or via fax to 253-322-9985. Once the notice of intent and all of the supporting documentation are provided, the information will be reviewed and determined if the claim meets the criteria of the submission.
One thing I want to add here on that last issue with the case, all the supporting documentation, everything has to be provided at one time. So when you submit that notice of intent form, you need to have all of your other required notification included with that. Now what Sherry does is she'll review that information, and if there's anything missing, she will come back to you and let you know that, and then give you an opportunity to provide that missing information. But it's important that you get your case together before you submit that notice of intent form. Sherry, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so upon review, if it is determined that the submitted claim has already been reviewed and has already been through, then the claim will be dismissed. A copy of the previous decision will be forwarded to the involved parties, which is the moving and the responding parties. The decision in the former proceeding will be applied to the current claim. The involved parties, moving and responding parties, will have 10 days to provide additional information on why the precedent decision does not apply to the current claim, or why the previous decision poses a conflict with the agreement. Upon receipt and review of the information, IANA will commence the arbitration process. So you'd have to provide us information on why you feel that that decision, that previous decision, does not pertain to the claim. There has to be a reason and there has to be a difference. If the claim is determined to meet the criteria, it will be then forwarded to the involved party, which is the invoicing party, for comment. They will have 15 days to provide their comments. Once the comments have been received by the responding party, the case will be compiled for an arbitration panel's review. So we will send it over to the panel for review and determination.
And one item in regards to the items that Sherry just covered, there are often times that we'll get cases that will involve similar types of issues where there's been a prior case decision rendered. So what she just went over is, if we receive a case and there's been a prior decision, then we will then forward that prior decision to the involved parties, and that will be the decision in the case, unless either the parties can provide evidence or documentation that indicates they don't feel this prior decision applies to their current circumstances under this dispute. So if you submit one of those claims and Sherry comes back to you with that information, she'll make it clear that this case has been looked at before and its decision has been rendered in those particular set of circumstances. And then it'll be up to the involved parties to determine if they have additional documentation that separates their claim from the prior decision.
So once the comments are received by the responding party, we will compile the arbitration packet and send it over to the modal arbitration panel members for review and determination. The arbitration panel members will have 45 days to render their decision. Once the decision has been rendered, both invoicing party and invoice party will be advised of the decision. The losing party will be responsible for the arbitration filing fee associated with the case. No appeal process is offered under the binding arbitration process. All decisions rendered by the panel are final. The arbitration case decisions are posted on the UIIA website and should be used as a reference tool to determine if a previous case decision with similar circumstances has already been rendered by the panel. If you go to the UIIA.org's homepage and scroll down past the orange box to the binding arbitration language, which Debbie's going to pull up here, it's right underneath the orange box. So it says binding arbitration process. You want to click on the view prior case decisions. And then if it's an M&R repair, you would click there and go by the section of the agreement. Or if it's a per diem invoice dispute, you would go under the per diem. From here, I'd give it over to Debbie to finish the webinar.
As Sherry indicated, that when cases are received, they're reviewed by the modal panel members, arbitration panel members. So if it's a case involving a steamship line and a motor carrier, it would go to an ocean carrier and a motor carrier panel member to review. The current members of the Intermodal Interchange Executive Committee serve as the arbitration panel members. Currently, we have 5 teams that we rotate on a monthly basis that review cases. If the 2 modal panel members that are reviewing the case can't reach a consensus on the decision in the case, then the case goes to the senior arbitration panel team for final determination. And that senior arbitration panel is comprised of the longest tenured IIC members from the motor carrier, ocean, and rail sectors. The final determination for the case is based on the majority decision of that senior arbitration panel. We don't have a lot of cases that get to that point where the 2 modal members cannot reach a consensus, but if there is ever a situation where they can't, that's how the arbitration case is handled. It then goes to that senior panel member, senior panel team for final determination. And all decisions are rendered based on the terms and conditions of the UIIA and the actual equipment provider's addenda that's involved in the case. We also currently get a lot of questions sometimes on whether a suspension of the motor carrier's interchange privileges can be done while the charges are being disputed or while they're under arbitration. Motor carrier's interchange privileges cannot be suspended by the EP for charges that are under arbitration while the decision is being rendered. However, there are times that a motor carrier and an equipment provider may be and have another issue that they're involved with that has nothing to do with the charges under arbitration, that the EP can then suspend the motor carrier's interchange privileges as long as they provide them the proper notice as is required under the UIA, which is the equipment provider has to notify them no less than 3 business days prior to the suspension occurring. Should a motor carrier find that when they dispute a claim that their interchange privileges have been suspended for the specific charges that are under arbitration, they should contact our office so that we can in turn then contact the EP that's involved in the case and request that the suspension, well, we'll first ask them to confirm that the suspension that is currently in place is related to the charges under arbitration, and then if they are, we'll then request that they lift that suspension until the decision is rendered in the arbitration case. So, Sherry, you want to go ahead and give us some of those questions that we've gotten?
This one here is, aren't the MTOs agents of the marine terminals and considered so in the UIIA?
Okay, so the question was, aren't the marine terminals considered agents of the steamship lines and then part of the UIIA? And the answer to that question is no, they interchange equipment on behalf of the line, but they're not signatories to the UIIA. So they're not obligated to the terms and conditions of this agreement, the actual marine terminal themselves. The equipment providers have to ensure that those marine terminal facilities that are interchanging their equipment, though, however, because the equipment provider is a signatory, they have to make sure that they're doing so in compliance with the UIIA. So that's why I mentioned earlier in regards to equipment return information that it's important that the equipment providers make sure that those terminals they use know that they have to provide that notification of changes to equipment return information to the motor carrier within a specific time frame, because then it allows them to provide the notice they're required to under that section E1B.
So on the DRP, what if the EP doesn't answer at all to their dispute?
Okay, so the question was, under the binding arbitration process, what if the EP does not respond at all to the motor carrier's initial dispute of the charges? And in that case, the motor carrier has to allow whatever time frame that equipment provider has to respond. So if the EP has 30 days to respond and then they don't respond, then you can submit the claim for binding arbitration out on the 31st day. And you just indicate when you submit your claim that you disputed it on this date and you received no response from the equipment provider. And then you would provide all your other supporting documentation in the case, and then we would then put the case together. It would go to the equipment provider for comment, and they would then have to indicate whether if they thought they had responded, they would have to provide evidence that they had responded to the claim. So all of that information would then be compiled and sent to the arbitration panel for review and consideration.
Can a motor carrier dispute of charges resulting from not receiving the required notification from the EP when the equipment return location changes?
Okay, so the question, if you weren't able to hear that, can a motor carrier dispute charges resulting from not receiving the required notification from the EP when the equipment return location changes? And the answer to that question is yes. If that dispute involves per diem or maintenance and repair charges that resulted from that notification not being provided, then you could certainly have the right to dispute those charges first with the equipment provider, and then again, if there's no resolution between the parties relating to that dispute, then as a UIIA participant, you would have the opportunity to submit that for binding arbitration if you elected to do so.
Where do I get the intent to dispute form?
Okay, there was a question as to where do you get the binding arbitration packet information. You can get that information on the UIIA website. Again, if you go to our home page, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's right under the orange box, there's a binding arbitration section. There's a link to download the packet there, and then if you want to view prior case decisions, if you go to that page, there's another link here to download that packet.
What about storage charges inquired when empty equipment cannot be returned? How can the motor carrier get compensated for these charges?
Okay, so the question was about storage charges are incurred when empty equipment cannot be returned, and the how does the motor carrier recoup those charges? And again, the terms of compensation for storage charges are outside of the UIIA. And would be addressed within a commercial transportation agreement between the motor carrier and the EP.
What email address does the EP have to send changes to equipment return notifications to?
Okay, the question was, what email address does an equipment provider have to send changes, the equipment return notification changes to? And the answer to that is notices under the UIIA are to be sent to the email that is shown for the individual in the UIIA subscriber record. So many motor carriers often use a distribution email address as their main UIIA contact information, so that when notices are sent either from our office regarding addenda revisions, or so that when the EP uses that email address, it not only goes to one individual, but it goes to multiple individuals within their company. So the suggestion would be that if you're a motor carrier and you want multiple people within your organization to receive notifications, that you set up an email distribution list and then send us that email, or update your UIIA account to use that email distribution address versus an individual's address.
Is there a tool or a website to determine the equipment owner?
The question was, is there a tool or a website to determine the equipment owner? I'm not real clear on that particular question. We may have to follow up with you after the webinar. I mean, if you have the container number or bill of lading, you should be able to determine who the owner of that equipment is, but we'll follow up with that party. We'll mark that question that we'll follow up with you after the webinar and try to get you some additional information on that question.
How can the EPs find out if an arbitration's been submitted?
Okay, the question was, how can an equipment provider find out if an arbitration claim has been submitted by a motor carrier? And what happens is, when the claims are submitted, we review them internally to make sure all the information's there, make sure all the timelines have been met, and that it's actually acceptable to go through the arbitration process. After that, Sherry then compiles the case, and then based on Exhibit D of the UIIA, it then goes to the responding party, which in that case it would be the equipment provider. So you'd be notified once the case was accepted under the arbitration process. You'd be notified and then sent the information and given 15 days to provide your comments as the responding party to the case.
What can we provide in place of EIR documentation from a paperless terminal when they don't provide the EIR?
The question was, what can you provide in lieu of the paper EIR if that's not provided by the terminal? The only thing I can suggest is if they should have some type of documentation that they give you, whether it be an electronic screenshot or something when you're interchanging that equipment. So anything that's showing exactly, when you outgated that equipment and when you brought that equipment back in, whether it be a terminal screenshot or whatever that particular facility is using.
Does the losing party have to reimburse the disputing party for the full amount of arbitration?
The question is in regards to the reimbursement of the arbitration fees. The prevailing party, if the prevailing party remitted the payment of the arbitration fees, which is $50 and then $250 for the case that goes through the full arbitration process, the answer is yes, those parties do need to be reimbursed for the full amount of the arbitration fees. I believe, Sherry, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you provide the case decisions to the involved parties, that you indicate that they need to generate an invoice, right, and you give them the contact.
And the amount.
You give them she gives you the contact and the amount that you need to generate the invoice for to the losing party so that you can gain reimbursement for that. And if for some reason the actual Exhibit D of the agreement states that the parties have to comply with the arbitration decision within 15 days. So if that doesn't happen within the 15-day period, we do often have companies that come back to us indicating that, both EPs and motor carriers indicating that the decision hasn't been complied with, and then what we do, we'll then follow up with the specific parties in regards to the actual arbitration case decision that was rendered.
Some EPs only send correspondence to main email and not the ones listed for each department. Do the motor carriers have any resource if notification are not going to the specific department contacts listed in the UIIA?
Okay, I think the question was, under the UIIA, motor carriers have the ability to add other contacts. And what happens is, because the agreement under G14B states that notifications need to be sent to the UIIA subscriber on record, that the equipment providers use that main email address, which is what they're required to do under the UIIA. But if there are motor carriers that have added other contacts to their company for specific types of issues, like they may have a per diem contact, they may have an M&R contact, the equipment providers have the ability to see that information when they look your account up online through the UIIA web interface, but they don't get that information via EDI if they're getting a feed from us or anything. So you may want to reach out to the equipment provider and let them know that you've provided an additional contact for that specific reason under the UIIA, but in order to comply with the agreement, the equipment provider is to provide it to the party that's on the UIIA subscriber record.
What is the EP's recourse if a facility does not abide by the UIIA requirements, whether it's related to closing gates or approving copies of interchange info?
Okay, the question was in regards to what recourse an EP has if the marine facilities they use don't comply with the terms of the agreement when they're interchanging their equipment. I mean, the response there, and Mark, jump in if you have anything to add on this, but because the marine facilities, that is a commercial agreement between the equipment provider and the marine facility operator in regards to the terms under which their equipment is interchanged, that would be something outside of the UIIA that would have to be handled between those two parties.
Correct. You got it.
Any other questions, Sherry?
Where do you find the allocated time frames for the EP review and dispute times?
The question was, where do you find the time frames for the EP to review and the dispute time frames? There are base time frames in the agreement. If you're dealing with a specific equipment provider, my suggestion is you need to check their addendum first. The addendum, if it has a dispute resolution process that has a time frame within it, then that would be the applicable time frame. If there is a dispute resolution process but there's no time frame, then that would then default back to Section H1 in the agreement, which is 30 days from receipt of the invoice to dispute the charges, and the EP has 30 days to respond to your dispute upon their receipt of your dispute.
Are misuse charges included under the DRP?
No. The question is currently misuse charges applicable to the binding arbitration process, and at this time, no, they are not. The acceptable types of charges are per diem charges and maintenance and repair charges and equipment use rental charges, which would be applicable associated with chassis providers for the rental of the leasing of their chassis.
Can you dispute per diem charges for equipment that you didn't pick up?
The question is, can you dispute per diem charges for equipment that you didn't pick up? I'm not quite clear on that question, so I think we may have to follow up with that individuals afterward.
I think the invoice would have to be in your company name in order to dispute it. So
yeah. I mean, the part of the documentation that has to be submitted for a binding arbitration claim is the actual invoice, and that invoice has to be in your company's name in order to show that you're being charged for those particular charges that you're disputing. But we'll note that when and follow up with that individual that submitted that question as well.
Are chassis pools bounded by the UIIA agreement?
The question was, are chassis pools binded by the UIIA agreement? And the answer to that is depending on whose chassis you're using and within that pool. If the chassis is being interchanged as part of the UIA equipment provider's interchange of both the container and the chassis, if it's falling under that UIA equipment provider's contract with your company, then yes, it would be covered under the UIA. But if you are paying chassis rental fees for the use of that chassis to track FlexiVan or DCLI, who are currently not, or the major chassis providers, but they're not currently UIA participants, then the answer is no. Then anything related to the terms and use of those chassis when you're paying chassis rental fees to those providers would be outside of the UIA and covered under your commercial agreement with those particular chassis providers.
What happens if the EP sends the invoice after 30 days? How can I dispute it?
Okay, the question was, what happens if the EP sends the invoice after the 30-day period? Well, it depends on what the time frame is for the EP to send that invoice. If it's a per diem invoice, the equipment provider has 60 days from the date you return the equipment to invoice you for those charges. So if they're outside of that time frame, then of course you then, as the motor carrier, would have the ability to dispute those charges based on that reason. And then, hopefully the issue would then be able to be resolved between the parties. But if not, then you would then have the ability to submit that claim for binding arbitration. So I think we're about at the time frame. Questions regarding the UIIA can be directed to our general mailbox at uia@intermodal.org, or again, if you have related ongoing business process issues that are associated with UIA provisions, then you can send those items to uiaissues@uia.org. That email box is checked once a day for items. And thank you again for attending the webinar. And don't forget, the second webinar in this series will be held on June 18th. Information regarding that session will be sent out to UIA participants shortly. And have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.